Welcome and thank you for joining Seyfarth's webinar, Unveiling Trade Secrets Breaches, Leveraging Forensic Examinations for Robust IP Protection. All participants are in listen-only mode. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the window on the Q&A section located on the right side of your WebEx program. We will do our best to get to everyone's questions. Any unanswered questions will be followed up by email after the webinar. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down. It will not be repeated and is required for a CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and presentation materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Dawn. Dawn, you may begin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dawn Mertnight. I'm a partner in Seyfarth's Boston office, and I'm a part of the Trade Secret Computer Fraud and Non-Compete group. With me today on the panel are Matt Kristoff, who's also a Seyfarth partner out of our Chicago office. Matt is in the e-discovery and information governance group. And we're also very happy to have Dan Fuller here. Dan is a managing director at Stone Turn in Boston. Stone Turn does a lot of different things, but the reason Dan is here with us today is because one of the things that I use Stone Turn for is forensic analysis and examination. So thank you to Matt and Dan for being here today as well. And let's take a look at our agenda. So as you'll see here, we're going to start with an overview of forensic examinations and investigations. We're also then going to talk about sources of forensic information and then how to use forensic examinations both offensively and defensively, how to draft and implement forensic protocols, and then finally remediation and post-examination review. If we have time, we will answer questions, and if we don't have time to get to your question, please still feel free to drop a note in the Q&A section, and we will try to follow up with you after the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Matt, who's going to start us off.
Thanks very much, Don. So one thing that we wanted to cover right at the start is kind of an overview as to what forensic examinations are and kind of what the purpose of them is. Really, this is trying to find those digital needles in our ever-growing digital haystacks. We're trying to interrogate our evidence, see what types of information we can aggregate together and build a timeline, build a story that might help support instances of suspicious conduct or unlawful conduct by employees or by other individuals. Now, they can be used in litigation, especially trade secret misappropriation matters, where you may be asking for documents as part of your RFPs, and those may be looking for kind of content, email requests or file productions, but they may not be getting at the metadata, what's actually happening around the documents and how they made their way from maybe one source to another. They can also be used during kind of prior to litigation. Maybe there's an employee whose activity is a little bit suspicious, or maybe there are some clients or some customers that may be transitioning over to a competitor. And you may be wondering how that's happening, why that's happening, and if there's any information that you can glean from your systems, from your devices that may support kind of those thoughts. Now, I will say that a lot of the time, the forensic investigation is more focused on the actual activity, user activity, device activity, that timeline, rather than content. But I want to keep in the back of your mind that sometimes the actual production of documents, there's some forensic activity that you can focus on individual documents. And I'll give you a brief example. I had a large kind of matter between two very large companies, and there was an allegation that technical documentation was taken from our client, transferred to this new company. And they denied it and said that, no, these are all original documents that we created. Fortunately, they had produced those documents to us in native format. And while we had put them up side by side, and we could see that the content was very similar, including certain phrases that were identical, but there was no reference to our client's name within the document. In fact, every time our client's name appeared, it seemed like there had been a find and replace in this new technical documentation. Fortunately, because the documents have been produced natively, when we processed them, we were able to extract out embedded objects and other information that would not be clear on the face of the document. For example, when we kind of dug into that information that was extracted, we saw our references to our client's logo and images that couldn't be found and replaced. Also, we found notes and other kind of supporting information that had been embedded in the document, notes that had dates attributable to them before the company, the kind of opposing party, was even formed. And of course, they were references to our own employees. So, that's another example where, a lot of this presentation will discuss kind of device forensics, account forensics, and kind of what other information you can gather. But there's other sources that you can think about that may be kind of more fine-tuned based on the data that you have. And that's kind of an overarching theme here, is that you're going to be dealing, kind of combing through a ton of information. But again, you're limited to what you have. Next slide, please. So there are some differences here between forensic discovery and traditional discovery that we may, that it's important to think about. For example, your preservation obligations in a normal matter often arise when you reasonably anticipate litigation, and then you can go through your kind of standard processes, placing accounts and devices on legal hold, investigating what information may be relevant to specific claims, and then making sure that information is preserved. Forensics, because there is so much information that is actively being collected, and kind of transferred and maintained, the retention on that is actually pretty small. Often audit logs and other information may only be retained for 7 days, 30 days, 90 days tops. And, the different platforms that you're dealing with may retain information during different periods of time. So you should think about at the outset of your case, if forensics, if kind of trying to build those timelines is going to be critical to your case, how a document moved from your systems to an employer or to the opposing party systems. That's something that you would want to evaluate and work closely with your IT group to identify, what's the retention on each of these. That's not to say that we're going to export or change the retention policies across your organization. That wouldn't make sense. But what we can do is, if you potentially extend those retention periods for particular users that may be relevant to the case, or if that's not possible based on the specific platform in place, run regular exports. Get that information out of your platforms and retain it so that you can then aggregate it later if necessary. It's far cheaper to have a spreadsheet of data, of kind of audit logs, VPN logs, all those types of information that is often retained for a small period of time. Grab that information. If we don't use it, great, but we can't go backward. That's one of the things that I think we see on a regular basis. It's, well, I suspended the retention limitations today, and okay, well, we don't have that data from before, or when we thought that there might be a problem months ago, we didn't take those steps. So it's always easy to flip that switch and flip it back. If it ends up being that there was no problematic activity, then you can kind of revert those changes that you made. One thing regarding different collection workflows, and Dan is familiar with this without question, that there's different ways that you can proceed with a forensic collection. Whether it's on site, a forensic technician would actually come to the location, and that can be helpful if there are a variety of devices that can be kind of imaged at once. Or there's maybe some ambiguity regarding specifics that it's a lot easier to kind of troubleshoot in the environment. Sometimes when a device is shipped to a lab, there may be kind of either types of information that is necessary to boot the device, or different pieces of information that make it a little bit more difficult to image. And kind of working with your forensic consultants to identify what the most appropriate and cost-effective option is going to be critical. You really should be thinking about this and kind of evaluating as you go through this process, what can we do better? And we'll talk about that at the end, that kind of it's a holistic approach. At the end of one of these kind of forensic investigations, where were the pain points? How can we make sure that it's smoother in the future? I will go ahead.
So one of the things to consider too with remote collections. So we do get questions a lot of, oh, can't you just remote into my computer and collect the entire thing? And that is a possibility. We would actually send out a hard drive to wherever this computer is, and remote in using our forensic software and create that forensic image of the entire computer. In doing that, we're making all of these changes to these computers in doing that. So if this is a case where activity is really important, that we're not overwriting things that have already happened, it's more, if it's probably more advantageous to do this either in lab or on site, where we can actually remove a hard drive from a machine and put it on what's called a write blocker to be able to prevent any writes from happening to that hard drive, so that we're not stomping all over things as we're collecting it. So that's just another consideration on the different workflows there.
And it can help to avoid often, you may, if there is a remote collection, you may see activity that there was a USB device that was plugged in the day the forensic vendor was involved. And that can easily be explained. The vendor can, often it's not an issue because it's clear why that connection occurred. But sometimes you can get opposing counsel that insists that there is a problem and they require a declaration from the forensic consultant. And there's, just some additional headaches. And you may be able to get a sense of that based on discussions with opposing counsel, how technical they may be. And I will say, forensics is going to be more expensive than kind of a traditional discovery in some instances. And so it's not appropriate in every case. And I think that we often see requests from non-technical counsel that want a forensic image of the email server or something, things that don't necessarily make any sense, and that there's no benefit, no gain from doing that. You're looking for the mailbox. We can do that in a forensically sound manner. And so, it's just one of those things that you should kind of take a step back. Is it necessary here? And if it is, there's some things that we should do. But if not, kind of weigh the cost and the benefits of it. And you may get a sense of that based on communications from opposing counsel, whether or not they're going to go down that road and whether or not it's appropriate. And as we've mentioned, certain case types are, and which I'll actually mention in a moment, are perfect for forensics. Next slide, please. So these are a few right here. The most common is an employee will go from one employer to a new employer, like a direct competitor, and there's some concern that they took the keys to the kingdom with them. Often, client lists or other information that was kind of specifically, held in high regard is something that we're on the lookout for. And there may be processes in place. Some organizations will have notifications, things that are monitoring their systems, so that if a USB is plugged in and information is copied, they get a notification. Many companies do not. And so that's one of the kind of hurdles that you're going to have to deal with is, how do you identify if there's a problem? Often, if someone decides that they're not going to tell you where they're going, or that they're going to a competitor, there's kind of discussion around the water cooler as to where someone's going. You may want to take those steps right away to preserve those devices and kind of their account. Often you may not find out where they went until 30 days, 60 days after someone leaves an employer. And that can be problematic. Sometimes an email account may be disabled, and per your standard retention policies, it gets wiped. As if you have these concerns, take those preservation steps. You can always revert them. Corporate devices being returned, I'm seeing this more often where their corporate laptop, their corporate mobile device, or a USB device a hard drive that they used for business are returned after a significant delay, or they may be returned in a state that is a little bit questionable. I've seen a number of people where the corporate laptop is returned completely wiped, actually kind of no operating system. It's unusable unless a new operating system were put on top of it. And they often, the description is that, oh, well, I just wanted to return it as I got it. And a lot of those just kind of raise your hackles, that doesn't seem right. Or they'll say, well, I had some personal information on there, so I needed to wipe it. Okay, well, you could have selectively deleted the personal information rather than the entire device. So there's a few things that if, a lot of the time I say that some of these forensic investigations are kind of a gut check. That's going to guide whether or not you think something's a little bit off, a little bit fishy here. But again, you got to balance it with kind of the kind of overarching, your strategy and what you're actively trying to pursue. Um, Now, that's not to say that forensics is always expensive. Right here, we kind of reference that there's a variety of reports that can be run, that I'm sure, Dan, he gets, 8,000 of these a day. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. Various activity reports that are going to be requested in most cases because one, they're easy to generate, and they will identify maybe different avenues that you want to pursue, certain things that may lead to important information, um, or tell you that there maybe isn't anything here. Maybe this, we thought that an employee was doing something, and as we looked at their computer, we found that it looked like they were all doing kind of standard business processes. But one thing I will mention is that, again, these forensic investigations, the reports that you are running, are going to be limited to the types of data that you're looking at. So the sources that you have available will guide which reports you're actually going to generate. There may be platforms, databases where that activity is not going to be captured on the device. There may be web-based information not going to be captured on the device, or you may see a few artifacts, but not kind of the full story. And so you should think about, not only involving IT, but also supervisors, managers that may be able to give a description as to what is the target employee doing on a regular basis, and maybe what are they not doing, what should they not be accessing. Um, Again, with regards to forensics, because the cost can balloon out, get those cost estimates beforehand. For these default reports or these standard reports, how much is that going to run on average? And then you can always caveat it with, if we need to do a deeper dive, how many hours would it take to investigate, print activity, or how much activity, to kind of reconstruct websites that someone may have viewed, if it's possible at all. And so working with your forensic vendor to really find out what that process can be and what it's going to look like can help control costs. You can always dig in deeper if you need to. Next slide, please. So here's a variety of things. These are some of those kind of low-hanging fruit things that we often request. I will say that, I do have printing activity on here. If it's something that those employees are actively doing, I did have a recent matter where a kind of large laser printer was at issue. They were trying to kind of extract information from that device to see what was submitted. It was a situation where a lot of employees all moved to, went to a competitor. And so the actual printer itself, what was printed and when, was something that they were very interested in. And that doesn't mean that there needs to be a full-blown, we're pulling the hard drive from this, kind of off-brand printer and trying to reconstruct it. There may be some audit logs or information that we can just simply export from the printer. But identify those, involve your forensic vendor, because they will help you guide to the most cost-effective solution. But the information here can be very helpful, but again, it depends on your IT infrastructure. One thing that I will mention about your IT infrastructure is that your IT likely knows about not only the information that's kind of corporate approved, the platforms that are in place, if you're using Teams for chats, but are people using Slack? Are there other platforms that may not be approved but are not necessarily forbidden? They're allowed based on the policy, but there's no tracking, there's no further information that really digs into kind of what that information might be. It's often helpful if you're talking to, when you're kind of doing an interview with maybe a supervisor, a manager, or someone else in the team. How do you guys communicate? Is it often that when you're going to a client site, do you upload documents to Dropbox so that you don't have to worry about taking a thumb drive, or you don't want to email it to yourself, and you're afraid kind of on different transfer speeds, or maybe USB devices are commonly used so that you can bring it to a client site. If that's the case, then you see 400 USB devices used by a certain employee. That doesn't mean that they are taking a ton of data with them. It may just be part of their standard business practices. But again, those kind of personal devices or personal accounts that are being used, if it's something that is often used by these team members, just find out about it so it's not a surprise, and you can kind of check it off in your list. When you see it in a report, you know why it might be there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Forensics are great. They can identify so much information, and there is often too much information that we have to comb through and figure out the most effective way to do that and get to those needles. But again, it's not perfect. And again, there's things that the forensic examinations don't reveal. And I'll hand it over to Dan.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so some of the things that were asked pretty much on every one of these types of matters is, can you get the history of all files that were copied over to a USB device? And unfortunately, absent a robust monitoring system, the default, Windows operating systems, Mac operating systems just don't log that activity. We can kind of back into it from other artifacts. We can see the connection of a USB device that's logged on a specific date. And then we can see file activity for when someone opens a specific file. And so if they, we see the USB device being connected and then a document on the desktop being accessed, and then a few minutes later, that same document being accessed on the USB drive, we can kind of infer that that may have been copied to the USB device. And then we get information from the USB device, like the electronic serial number, where that can be used to then request that specific device, so that when we get it in our hands, we can confirm that files were in fact copied. But it does require having that specific device. We also get asked, can you see the entire history of everything that's ever been on this computer? Can you see everything that's been deleted? And we can do some recovery, but unfortunately we can't. Once files are deleted, they may be recoverable for a certain amount of time, but as new data comes in, that will then overwrite what's in the free space or the unallocated space of the hard drive, meaning that new data comes in and wipes out the old data as it comes in. So there's just, we can do some recovery, but we can't say, oh, everything, we're not seeing something on here in terms of deletion, so it wasn't deleted or wasn't ever on here. We can't say that because we don't have 100% record of everything that was on the machine. In terms of smartphones, we are also asked, can you get the email that's on smartphones? And it really depends on the type of collections. Phones are kind of a different beast in themselves, where the compatibility of our tools really depends on the type of phone, the version of the software that is running on the phone. Do they have updates? So we're kind of in an arms race with the manufacturers of the phone with the forensic software, meaning a new version of Apple iOS comes out. All of a sudden, our forensic tools can't collect data from that anymore because they've updated their security policies. So we then have to wait for the forensic tool to then figure out how to then collect data from this new version. So we're constantly looking for, constantly updating our tools, constantly maintaining them to make sure that we have the most current version so that we can support the widest variety of devices. But we may get into a situation where, like, oh, this person bought a brand new iPhone 15 Pro Max, they just updated it, we want to collect data off of it, and we go to connect it, and then it's like, oh, this is not compatible. So then we have to figure out the best way at that point to get the data off the device.
And I will say that I've encountered this recently and particularly with iOS devices. I had one recent matter that Don was on as well, where 2 iPhones were collected and they were parsed using the current version of a industry standard mobile device software, and it extracted a set amount of data, and it seemed a little bit lower. And so we asked them to the vendor to look into it. And after a bit of investigation, they realized that a recent patch to that software had broken how the data was being parsed. By the time that they concluded their investigation, a patch had been issued, which restored it and identified a significant amount of additional data. But it was one of those things where not only discussions with the custodian, knowing kind of what normal usage patterns might be, helped us to identify what otherwise we may just have thought that there was no data there. So it is something that's actively happening, and I feel like iOS is constantly evolving.
Yeah, and when we know phones are involved, we also ask about third-party messaging, because sometimes things like WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal aren't supported with a specific type of collection. We may have to go into a different type of collection that takes significantly longer, maybe up to 12, 18 hours for a single phone to be able to collect that data, if it's even compatible with that phone. So we always ask at the outset, what types of communications are in play here, so that we can make sure that we're addressing that at the point of collection, and not, imaging the data, come back and be like, oh, we're not seeing any Telegram messages, and then coming back and like, oh, well, we need to do this other collection now, which we should have done from the first place. So I think we can move on to the next slide. So for we talked a little about this before, but there's a number of different sources of forensic information, not just phones or hard drives. I mean, we're talking anything that has either a hard drive storage or flash storage. So that includes like your standard laptops, your desktops, even servers. But we can also collect data from social media. So if there is somebody out there that is posting confidential information on social media, we may need to collect that account, so we can target a specific Facebook account and pull down all that information. Email accounts, personal email accounts themselves, we can go in and with the user's credentials, their username and password, remotely from our lab, we can connect to those email accounts and pull those all down, so we have a complete copy of the account. Or if there are specific targeted folders or time range, we can also limit that to the specific time range to collect. Another large one is cloud platforms. Somebody's using Dropbox to store all of their files. It's the same thing. We can remotely collect that type of data using the credentials from our lab. And on top of that, there's also databases or structured activity that could be in other places. So there could be a database system that is functioning completely separate from the user's computer, but that computer is interacting with that database. So then when we get the computer and we go to look in for that activity, none of it is on the computer itself. It is all housed up within that database. So then we would need to figure out what the best way to collect that information from that particular source is.
And I will mention, with regards to cloud platforms, I did have a matter where whether or not someone was actually logging into Dropbox, how often they were logging into Dropbox was important, and from their personal devices, and how many devices were syncing to that device. And so traditional collections, kind of forensically sound collections of the data of that content may grab what's there. But there's also other areas to look at when you're logged into some of these accounts that may allow you to show, in kind of settings or privacy, which devices are connecting or have been authorized to sync information, and when was the last time that they connected. And some, certain forensic software may not grab that information or collect it easily. And so you may default to screenshots of that information if it can't be kind of pulled in another fashion. But that can be helpful, especially when the forensic vendor gets access to the database or to the platform. Grab as much additional information as you can. You may not need it, but it will, help you investigate, at worst, there's nothing there, not important. But if it's another avenue, another way that an employee may be taking data from you, you want to know about it.
Yeah, like specifically these cloud syncing platforms like Dropbox or OneDrive. If you see that activity in internet history that they're accessing it, and then that leads you to then request that account, you request the account, and then you look in and see that it's synced with, 3 other home PCs that have now had all of this data from the employee's computer uploaded and then synced down to their personal devices. If the ultimate goal is to remediate that data, you have 3 other places now that you need to remediate that data. All right, I think we can move on. Next slide. So it's just some of the different analyses that we do specifically on computers. I probably won't go through all of these here, but I mean, one of the easiest low-hanging fruit things we do is a full file listing of what's on a computer, just so that the case team or the client can know what exactly is on the computer. And typically will parse that down, filter it down just for business type documents, because there's a lot of system related files. So we're just trying to get a snapshot of what's on the computer. Does the employee have documents on there that they should not have access to? And that's just an easy way to provide a report for somebody to review and see, is there anything interesting on here just based on file name. We talked about this before, USB activity. We can see, from when a USB device is connected, we get the date of connection, the time, the serial number of the device, and that may go back only for a certain amount of time. Like Matt was talking about retention period, so it's good to image these as soon as we can, because some Windows machines are only holding USB activity up to, I think I've seen some only a month, or 7 days. It really depends on the system. So we may not get a full history of every USB device that's connected, but it will be likely recent. Another large one is internet history. I mean, you get a lot of the sense of what people are doing in terms of activity from internet history. Accessing their personal Gmail, if they don't have Gmail synced down to their Outlook, so that all the Gmail files are coming down to the laptop, we wouldn't have access to what's on that Gmail account without actually getting the credentials to it. If they're accessing it through internet history, we may see a page that's the title of the page says, inbox, or a subjects of messages. So we may actually get an idea of, just from the internet history, what people are accessing from their personal email accounts. Like we mentioned before, cloud storage, if they're accessing Dropbox and that's not something that the company uses, that's usually a red flag to go back and say, well, we see you're using Dropbox. Now we need to get access to the account. Local email is also another big one, where even if it's company email, we will go through and if there's a local PST on the machine, which is, you use Outlook, and a PST or is where all of the email is synced down from the company server. We can look for somebody emailing things to their personal email account that IT may have not seen right off the bat. If they're emailing a bunch of attachments of sales reports or contact lists or things like that, that may be something that is interesting. Some of these others here are kind of link files, jump lists, shell bags. Those are more around user activity for accessing files. So it's kind of a report that goes back to a specific amount of time based on the retention. But if people are accessing files they're not supposed to, again, we were talking about earlier about people accessing files off USB devices, we may see that there. So just quickly running through some of those.
One thing I will note is that there's a lot of data here, and what is actually relevant to your case is going to require some involvement by the client as well. You know, to really point, this is normal, you know, this is not important, or this is while this has a lot of sensitive data, it was part of a presentation that they were about to deliver to a client. It makes sense why they would be accessing this. But if there's a file name, you know, there needs to be some additional info to help guide that investigation and to really kind of carve out, once we have some reports, you know, what is actually sensitive or what is something that, you know, we need to focus on more and see where this file, how it made its way here, and if it went anywhere else. And so that's just one of those things, because it is a large amount of data. We may not be as familiar with the specifics, other than if a file name looks sensitive, but you as the client will know more than we will.
Thanks. Next slide, please. In terms of cell phone and mobile devices, we're not getting, you know, the same level of activity that we are from a computer, but we are, the main things that we look at on cell phones are communications, you know, text message activity. Is someone sending you know, sensitive information to somebody at a competitor through text message? Are there, you know, lots of call log, you know, calls to employees who recently left, and then this person then shortly leaves after that? Have they put in their notes? We've seen this before, where they put in their notes file a lot of sensitive information. They've just copied and pasted it right into the notes app, so that they can have it when they leave. You know, we also look for specifically installed applications that may allow for exfiltration of data. If they have, again, talking about cloud storage, the Dropbox app on there, they may have synced data to you know, a cloud source. And even pictures and videos, somebody could go into all the sensitive documents that are on their machine, take screenshots of it, trying to, you know, obfuscate that they're taking this data. We actually have the ability through some automated software to categorize all of the pictures on a phone, and look for ones that are automatically identified as screenshots, you know, pictures of documents, and you know, things that may look like they're just textual information. So that's the big one that we do now. And then again, same with internet history. There's, you know, people do a lot of searching on their phones, so there may be something interesting in that internet history as well. You know, if you get a laptop that's returned, like Matt was saying earlier, that's completely wiped, and for some reason they give you their phone that's not wiped, and there's a search in there that says, how do I wipe my Dell laptop? That may be interesting. So yeah, if we can go to the next slide. So this is a screenshot from one of the forensic tools that we use called Celebrate. This is specifically for cell phone forensics. And these are just a lot of the different categories that Celebrate parses out. And a number of the things I just talked about are in here, but there are a lot of other artifacts that may be interesting in here, but some of them we don't tend to go into for employee, you know, related cases. But just, this is just kind of give you an overview of, just from a single phone, this is all of the data that's parsed out. So there's a lot of information that's in here. Next slide. And we briefly talked about cloud storage before as a source. where the classic ones are the syncing type of storage, Google Drive, OneDrive, Box, or Dropbox. Those are where you have a folder that you drag files into. They sync up to other cloud sources. iCloud's a little different. They do offer that same service, but we also collect iCloud backups of devices. So you may have somebody who has a phone that they hand over, and they've gone and deleted everything that they thought was useful on the phone. But then you get access to their iCloud account, and there's 2 backups of that phone from the prior day or the day before, where if you pull that backup down, if it's prior to when they deleted everything, you have everything that was there. So that's another great source that we look into. And there are other sources that we've also been involved with in specifically database type sources. A lot of people may go into Salesforce before they leave and run a bunch of different reports to pull out all of their contacts, to pull out a bunch of different reports that would be beneficial to them moving to another company. Knowing that those exports happened, knowing that when those happened, it was a week before they left, would be great information to have. And we have worked with Salesforce to export that specific data so that can be used. And then the last one here is other backup systems. So there are some backup systems that may be in use corporately, like Carbonite, that back up the entire laptop, and they do it in a process that is iterative, meaning it initially creates a single backup, and then anytime a file changes, it will do another backup. So if you want to go back to a specific day, you can restore all the files on that computer up to a certain time. I think it's, there's some sort of retention period on that as well, but that would be a good thing to find out if there's some sort of backup system that's in place here that we may be able to go back in time. If we do get a laptop that's wiped, maybe there's a backup of that entire laptop going back 30, 60, 90 days. Next slide. And then there's some less common sources, but potentially there may still be some information. Voice recorders. We actually just had a case where we had a voice recorder that came in that it was completely wiped, and we were actually able to go in and recover voice recordings back for a good amount of time. There was a good recording on there that was actually very pivotal to the matter we were working on. DVR systems are another one that can be a little tricky. They tend to be very proprietary, but I mean, if there's a DVR system in at the company, and you have a specific incident that happens. I mean, maybe you have somebody on camera that the camera's pointed at their screen, and you can see them, literally moving data. I mean, that would be something that we'd want to preserve. Digital cameras. I mean, we still sometimes get floppy disks and CD-ROMs that have information on it that may have been copied off. And I touched a little bit on backup tapes or systems. Carbonite is more of a cloud backup system, but you may still have a system where you're backing up to tape or external hard drives. That, again, if there's something that has gone, if there's somebody has wiped everything off their computer, it may be still within the backup system that exists. Very rarely, but sometimes we get actual GPS tracking devices that somebody could actually, magnetically stick to the bottom of a car, and that will actually have a USB device interface on it that is keeping all the information in there. So we have imaged those devices in the past. And then again, we talked about this earlier, but structured data sets, databases that may need to be collected separately that don't that wouldn't completely interact, that aren't on the system itself. It's in a remote location. Next slide.
All right, so I'm going to talk at this point about how we use examinations in litigation. First, I want to reiterate what we heard earlier, which is sometimes we use examinations before litigation even starts, before even a company has a concern that something nefarious had happened. Maybe the business has a key employee who's leaving, especially if they're going to a competitor. The business doesn't necessarily have any suspicions that this person has done anything wrong, but we'll try to do a preliminary look just to make sure. But when you're in litigation or preparing for litigation, oftentimes employers will engage an expert to take a look at the devices that belong to the employer. So company issued computers, email accounts, phones, things like that. And that can give you a sense, as all the ways that Matt and Dan just told us about, that you can start to see some signs of potentially nefarious or unlawful activity. Alternatively, it may be that the new employer, let's say they get a cease and desist letter from the former employer saying, we think this person has taken our data, and the new employer might want to take a look at their own systems to confirm that that new employee has not brought anything onto their systems, because that could create liability for the new employee. Obviously, you can only analyze what's in your control. So if a business has taken a look at its own devices that had previously been issued to the employee, they might see some concerning activity, but they aren't going to necessarily see what that employee or former employee is doing on their own time. So in order to do that, you either need to get a third-party forensic neutral to analyze the individual's devices and assets, or sometimes the individual will hire their own expert. I think more often than not these days, parties engaged in litigation will have a third-party forensic neutral, but sometimes the other side doesn't agree to it. And when that happens, you, as the plaintiff, often will need to move the court to order a forensic examination, because sometimes defendants just refuse to allow it, and you need to get the court to agree that you're going to do that. Next slide, please. So who should conduct the analysis? This is a big question. Some companies will have certain in-house capabilities, and as Matt said earlier on, you don't always need a full-blown forensic examination. So sometimes it is appropriate to use either in-house opportunities or otherwise limit. However, when you're in litigation, I do think that it is very, very important to be using an outside vendor who is reputable. And part of the reason for that, again, we heard a little bit earlier today about overwriting data. I've had cases where a computer was returned to the former employer, and somebody in the IT department booted it up, and that created an issue for metadata, because just simply booting up the computer changes the metadata. And then we had to explain later on to the judge how this was simply a mistake, and we actually, you can trust our forensics, but it created a big issue. So I just would warn you that it's better to get an expert involved early, unless it truly is one of those scenarios where it just looking at a preliminary search, or you have in-house capabilities that are pretty good. Next slide, please. So one thing to consider, obviously, is the scope of the examination. Whether the parties agree to an examination or you're asking the court to order one, the scope is going to be very important, because as we, again, have heard today, you can get a lot of data from these examinations, and you might not need that data or even want it. So things to consider are the devices to search. You don't necessarily need to search every single device or account that somebody has. The data that we're going to target, again, we all create lots of data. There are system files. Don't ask me what the system files do, but I know from Matt and Dan that they are usually junk, so you don't need to look at those files necessarily. Date ranges, a lot of people will work somewhere for years and years, and that's usually not relevant what they did 3 years ago. Search terms are a good way to limit what you're looking at, including limiting to search specific file types. One thing to consider is, how are we going to review the results? One thing that defendant's counsel will often say, and I have said this when I have been in that position, we don't want this to be a fishing expedition. My client's personal laptop has a lot of personal information. It also has privileged information. I don't want you just going through, looking at every embarrassing email they've sent. So usually we will recommend, as even when we're in the plaintiff's seat, as a way to be proactive and seem reasonable, some mechanism where you're not worried about that happening, either excluding certain types of emails. For example, you could exclude something that has the defendant law firm's domain name, or you could have a review process where opposing counsel gets to review the search terms first to make sure there's nothing that's solely personal, embarrassing, privileged before the hits get to the other side. And then also you want to consider what happens if you look at devices and you realize, oh, this is more expansive than we thought. This person emailed this document to their coworker, and now we're not just dealing with this one individual defendant, but we need to look at the entire email system for the coworker. So it's good to have a mechanism in the protocol that allows you to expand where it's appropriate. And then finally, thinking about the remediation process, what happens if you find confidential files? How are you going to deal with that? How does it get deleted? Who's paying for that? What is the process? We'll talk about that a little bit too. Next slide, please. So a protocol, usually when you have a forensic examination, there's an agreement, and it's, usually at least a few pages, sometimes much more than that. And it explains specifically how you're going to conduct a forensic examination. And again, it addresses a lot of those things that we just talked about a minute ago. How the protocol is drafted really depends on the circumstances. So it may be in a situation where I'm working with opposing counsel. Let's say I represent the plaintiff and opposing counsel is being reasonable and they're saying, yes, we agree, protocol is appropriate. I might be more willing to compromise because I know, it's better to have this worked out in an agreement without having to go to the court. Now, if opposing counsel says, no way, no how, I'm not letting my client submit to a forensic examination, well, the draft protocol that I'm going to attach to my motion to the court is probably going to be more aggressive because I don't need to worry about making certain compromises. That said, you also don't want to overreach because judges don't like that. Then you're giving opposing counsel an opportunity when they submit their opposition to your motion for an examination to say, Your Honor, look at what ridiculous terms they're looking for. And another reason that you should be mindful of the scope in when you're drafting is not just you don't want to frustrate the judge or opposing counsel, but sometimes, it's a matter of be careful of what you wish for. I've had many examinations where the results come back and it's like hundreds of thousands of files. And guess what? Someone needs to review that, and that gets expensive. And we have clients who might say, hey, here's a list of 350 search terms, and you need to say to them, that's going to pull back so many hits. We are going to spend tens of thousands of dollars just reviewing the results. Ideally, you would consult with a forensic expert before you put a protocol in front of opposing counsel or in front of a judge. And I can laugh at myself here because I have not always followed this advice, and Dan knows that. But it's really bad when you go to your forensic expert and say, good news, we have an agreed protocol, here it is. And they say, we can't do that, or that's going to result in way too many hits. So it's always a good idea to just run it by your expert before you get to a point where you're sharing it. Next slide, please. Okay, so you've agreed to the examination's scope and the parameters, you get the results, and now what do you do? So looking at when the business has a review of its own devices and email accounts and other sorts of accounts, that can help if you haven't litigated yet, determining whether there's a basis for litigation. So maybe you see something in the email, someone is sending a lot of documents to their personal Gmail where either that's against company policy or it's just not their practice. Then you might say, okay, you know what, it's time to file a lawsuit. Or it could convince you that there's nothing there. It can also enable you to reach out to the opposing party and have a pre-litigation settlement where they agree to remediate things and you don't even have to go to court, which is great. Another example of what might happen when you get the results is, again, you might see, okay, now we need to look at this individual's email account. We don't have access to their Gmail on their company issued device, obviously, but we can see that they forwarded these emails to themselves. So then you go to the opposing party and you say, we see that this happened. We need access to your Gmail account and your personal computer to make sure that this information didn't go even farther. Also, looking at the third-party neutrals report can be very helpful because, again, it can show you that there are smoking guns maybe, or conversely, it can show you that there's not much there and you don't want to spend a lot of time and money continuing litigation if it looks like your client's suspicions were not really borne out. Next slide, please. So one other thing, again, the reports and the results that you get back can be really, really voluminous. I do this work a lot. I deal with protocols a lot, and I think I'm pretty good at reviewing protocols and the results, but it's often hard to figure out what is relevant and what is not. So it is really useful to work with your expert and say, okay, we have this spreadsheet that has all these files on it and all these dates and showing me this, that, and the other. Can you help me digest this and tell me, what are the key pieces of evidence that I should highlight for the court or for opposing counsel if we're trying to leverage a settlement? One really big thing that I think a lot of litigants forget to do, use your own expert to review the other side's reports. So in a situation where there's not necessarily a third-party forensic neutral, but opposing counsel has their own expert, you can really use your own people to poke holes in what the other side has done. And I'll give you an example. I had a case many, many years ago where the defendant had their own expert. The expert submitted an affidavit to the court saying, I have looked at the defendant's Gmail account and I looked for any emails from John Doe at companyabc.com to John Doe at gmail.com. And there was nothing. So I am convinced that he didn't take anything with him. The problem with that, my expert said, well, that's somewhat compelling, but that's not the full story. If John Doe on his company issued computer pulled up Gmail, started an email, attached a file that he had saved on his company issued hard drive, and sent it either to his own Gmail account, to his new employer email account, or to somebody else at his new employer, well, that search from John Doe at company ABC to John Doe at gmail.com wouldn't show that. And so we submitted an affidavit saying, hey, that's great that you didn't find anything, but that doesn't tell the full story. And guess what? We ended up settling pretty quickly thereafter because there was a reason the opposing party's expert didn't have a more complete examination. So that is another reason that it's good to have a reputable expert on your side, not only to analyze your own, the client's own devices, but what the other side is saying as well. So I'm going to flip it back to Matt quickly for the next slide to talk about remediation.
Yeah, and I know we're running up on time, so I'll just say that remediation can be very difficult and it can be time consuming based on the types of sources that you're dealing with. If it's a workstation and there may be a specific folder, certain set of files, forensic vendors can target those, overwrite them appropriately, and make sure that they're removed. If it's an email platform, there's other steps that they can take based on how the information was collected and preserved. They can, we can identify it in platform A, and then the vendor can have that information remediated from the platform, from the email service. However, you should make sure that as part of your protocol that you're developing, what happens when information is identified for remediation. This can be extremely voluminous, as Don was mentioning. You should also put in a few different guardrails. If there's 1,000 documents, that's not so bad to get through. 20,000, that's a problem. And so you should build out what the identification remediation timeline looks like and make sure that your vendor signs off that, yes, we can do this in the time period that's allotted. When you're dealing with some older platforms, it can almost revert to a manual process to kind of search and delete. But in some instances, that may be completely fine. We're going to go into someone's Gmail account, like Don mentioned, search for particular phrases, delete that information. Kind of a low-hanging fruit, a cost-effective solution for doing that. We have a few different options here on kind of whether or not you're on the plaintiff side, defendant side, but you may want to incorporate into the remediation kind of tailoring your claims or get certifications that yes, information was deleted from this account, But once it was deleted, I no longer have any company related information in my possession, custody, or control. And getting that certification allows you a little bit of protection in case something is found down the line. Or if after this forensics process has concluded, what are you going to do next? Is there, you find an old flash drive. Who do you contact? What do you do with it? Because now, this is additional information. So there's a few different things that you can put into place to kind of protect yourself post remediation as well. Next slide, please.
And let's actually flip forward one more because we're at the hour and I want to give people the CLE code. There you go. It's SS3487. SS3487.
And with, I know, a minute left or so, I want to address a few of the questions that we did get in, one of which was whether or not a company should disable USB connections as kind of a means of preventing exfiltration of data. And I think this will depend on your experience. If I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be done for the full organization, although it could. Often we will see those organizations disable it. And then if you need access, you contact IT. There's a history of when you requested it and kind of what the reason for that is. I think that it's uncommon that it's kind of blanket prevented in most organizations, but I think that it can also, if there's people with highly sensitive data, those devices, it may warrant that those devices are locked down in that sense. And one of the other questions kind of relates to it is whether or not there are those types of logs for USB activity that's kind of standard. I would say most companies don't have those monitoring software installed that kind of on each workstation to check for that usage. And so it is a worth, if you're encountering instances where information is being exfiltrated, if this happens more frequently than you would want, it's not a bad investment to kind of have this installed. Microsoft 365 audit logs are a fantastic source of additional data that's outside but of kind of your normal user access. It's going to show what people are looking at on OneDrive, SharePoint, what they might be doing, files that they may be accessing from their mailbox. And these are things that are often maybe, I think, 30 to 90 days retention period. So you may want to kind of look into making sure not only that that's enabled, but that it's something that you're actively preserving. And if you want to bump out the retention policy for those audit records in particular, it's something that you can do on kind of a case by case or user by user basis.
One thing I want to say real quick, and I know we're over time, so I'm sure we've lost a few people, but for anyone who's still around, the USB question is interesting. And, certainly we do have clients, as Matt said, who are at least limiting access to USB drives, but don't think that that's the only way employees are exfiltrating data. It feels like every day there's a new method that I'm like, oh, that's a new one to me. I didn't realize they could do that. So, don't get complacent by thinking, oh, we actually had a client many years ago who literally like glued in the USB section so that like nobody could physically put anything in. So don't rely on things like that. It's helpful to limit stuff like that, but just be aware of the fact that employees are becoming more and more savvy about ways that they can transfer data. So with that said, thank you everyone. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully you found this informative. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And otherwise, have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.